On behalf of the LTO program, I'd like to welcome you today to talk about some of the most important topics in the storage industry. Today, I'm here with Phil Goodwin, who's a research director with IDC's Enterprise Infrastructure Practice, covering research on data management. Phil provides detailed insight and analysis on the evolving industry trends, vendor performance, and the impact of new technology adoption. Phil, welcome.
Hey, Geoff, how are you? Thank you.
I'm doing well. Well, great. Phil, you've been covering data protection for a long time. Can you start by giving us a perspective on the industry and where it stands today?
Yeah, you bet. And I have been covering it longer than I care to admit, but honestly, it's been pretty continuous since about 1997. But my first exposure to data protection, believe it or not, started as a college intern back in 1981, doing a product requirements doc for a new tape system at Storage Technology way back in the day. So this is definitely a topic that is near and dear to my heart. You know, there are a lot of people who think that data protection is maybe not a very dynamic market or very exciting, and they could not be further from the truth. The new technology, the changes that have taken place have been just absolutely amazing. And it's truly a dynamic market with all of the different changes that we've seen since the days of the mainframe, where we had basically a dump to tape once a day, to client server, where we had masters and slaves in our backup systems. And now we have virtual infrastructure, containers, cloud native, edge, IoT, all kinds of different systems that we need to protect. So it has truly become an amazing marketplace, Geoff.
So what are the driving forces or driving factors behind these changes?
I like to say that we are the tail of the dog, and the application is the dog, and we get wagged by it when we're in data protection. So we have to react to the various changes that are happening in the marketplace. And so now we have to protect both physical, virtual, container-based, IoT-based, cloud, core, edge, all the different possible permutations of different application deployments. Those different permutations have simply created a very complex infrastructure where there is a lot of different data that gets moved all over the enterprise that has changed the way we need to approach data protection.
What other factors are changing the data protection industry?
I think there are two key ones, Geoff. The first one is ransomware. And I can tell you in survey after survey that we conduct with IT organizations, ransomware and data security are always at the top of the list, or very close to the top of the list of priorities for these organizations. And the reason is ransomware has a profound impact potentially on an organization. When we survey organizations, they tell us there are really three key things that happen when they get attacked by ransomware. The first is loss of revenue. The second is permanent loss of customers. And the third is lost employee productivity. I think what they don't talk about as much is that people actually lose their jobs as a result of ransomware. So it's really something that has become top of mind for organizations. And because it is so pervasive into the organization, it has really created an environment where people actually spawn a disaster recovery response to it, because it can be so impactful to the organization. You know, a lot of organizations back in the day really took a risk when they would say, you know what, I don't live in a hurricane zone or a tornado zone or floods or earthquakes. So, you know, I'm going to take my chances on disaster recovery. If you're connected to the internet, you live in a ransomware zone. And so as a result, we're seeing a huge increase in disaster recovery deployments around the organization. The key there, Geoff, is that people need to have a method of restoring data that is absolutely reliable, that can assure that they will be able to recover that data in a reasonable period of time. And that reasonable period of time kind of leads us to the second topic here, which is data growth. Research that we show is that data is growing at about 35 to 45% compound annual growth rate per year. Of course, that depends on industry and organization and things like that. But if you think about that, that means your data is doubling approximately every 30 months. Now, I'm old enough to remember when a petabyte of data was a lot of data. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek because, of course, a petabyte is still a lot of data. But The days of having petabyte deployments, multi-petabyte, tens or even hundreds of petabytes are no longer remarkable. And so IT organizations need the ability to restore huge volumes of data in relatively short periods of time. And I think it's those two factors that are really shaping the way people approach data protection today, Jeff.
Okay, so to summarize, organizations are faced with data on a massive scale, and that's under constant attack from bad actors. And they can't afford to lose any of the data, and that needs to be always available. What could possibly go wrong?
Exactly right. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah, but it absolutely is a tall order for them, for IT organizations today, Jeff.
So then what kind of strategies can IT professionals take to protect data from ransomware on a petabyte scale and assure its recovery?
Where I would start is to understand that the bad guys have learned that the place to attack is the backup. So they attack the backup first. And their strategy is typically to either encrypt that data or corrupt that data and make it so it's unusable to the organization. And the reason they do the backup first is that way, when they go and attack the production data, there's really no way to restore it other than to pay the ransom. So in order to extract maximum value, they attack that backup. So step number one is protect your backup. And there are 5 key elements to doing that, Jeff. The first is encryption. The second is immutability. The third is an air gap. The fourth is a 3-2-1-1 backup strategy. And the fourth is a backup scanning capability. So let's talk about each one of those in turn and how that applies to protecting a backup. The first is encryption, and that is on the tape itself. It is often done by the hardware that's within the tape drive, which is government-grade encryption. It's virtually impossible to break, or it can be done by the software application itself. The important thing about encryption is that it protects from insider threats in particular. People shouldn't overlook that. Sometimes we think about hackers and so on. Of course, that's important, but many of the most devastating impacts are from insiders. And so that encryption helps to assure that the insiders can't get to the data, but it also protects against data leakage. So that's one of the other more recent strategies that ransomers are taking, is to extract the data and then in return for a ransom, not leak it onto the internet. And encryption can help avoid all those problems. The second is immutability, and that is to create a copy that even if the bad guys get in there, they can't corrupt it. So really the 4 things that the bad guys try to do to data is they try to steal it, they try to encrypt it, they try to corrupt it, or they try to delete it. So if you can thwart those 4 means, those are really getting at the heart of what ransomers are trying to do. So then the third that I mentioned is an air gap. And this is a physical separation between the production data and the backup data, where you have a separate control plane and a separate data plane in the protection of that backup, but also to make sure that even if the bad guys get into the system, they can't access the backup copies. And if they can't access it because it's physically not available, then you can protect yourself and be able to assure that you can restore that data. The fourth is the 3-2-1-1-1 strategy, where you have 3 copies of the data on 2 different types of media. One that is online and offsite. The other one is offline and offsite, which is basically the air gap copy. Then the fourth is the ability to take the backup and to scan it for malware. One of the problems that some IT organizations run into is when they restore the data after a malware or ransomware attack, is that malware got into the backup data, and so they simply restore it with all the other data. You have to have a way to scan for that and to scrub it out before it's restored.
So we're here to talk about LTO tape. So let's turn to see how tape can address some of these issues that we've just discussed.
Yeah, it's tape is one of those things that people tend to overlook. But in recent years, it has really been a surging technology. It has really come back into a strong favor in the market because it has the interesting kinds of capabilities that organizations need to protect backup, both from a ransomware standpoint as well as from a data volume standpoint. When you look at LTO tape, it in particular addresses the 5 things that I talked about. So let's go through those briefly and talk about how LTO addresses them. When you talk about encryption, you can take an LTO tape and you can encrypt it either using hardware that's in the tape drive itself or using external software. The hardware encryption is government grade encryption and virtually impossible to break. So this is something where you keep the internal threats out. But even if one of the bad guys, let's say a tape falls off the back of a truck and these guys pick it up, there's nothing they can do with it because it's encrypted and they can't get to it. The second is immutability. And immutability is on tape, has a couple of interesting capabilities. The first is what we call worm, or write once, read many. And you can set that, or you can create that setting in your backup so that that tape can never be changed. It can never be rewritten. And that's important because really the only way to change data on tape is to rewrite it. And that's not an easy thing to do if you don't have the right tools. And it's not that the bad guys can't figure it out, but it is a very challenging thing for someone who, especially who's external to the organization, to get in and actually rewrite a tape. You know, Geoff, I don't know if you remember that old joke about 2 guys running from a lion, and the first guy says, "How are we going to outrun this lion?" Second guy says, "I don't need to outrun the lion. I just need to outrun you." And that's kind of true with backup as well, and ransomware. If you can make yourself a more difficult target than the next guy, then the odds are they will simply pass you by and go on to somebody else. Because for them, it really is an ROI where they're trying to get the maximum value in the least amount of time. Then the fourth is an air gap. And I talked about being in data protection in the very early days, Geoff. And when we took a tape and we did a backup and we moved that tape to a shelf or to an offsite repository, we didn't think of that as an air gap, but that's absolutely what it was. And taking a tape out of a library, putting it into a secure location is by far and away the easiest, most cost-effective way to create an air gap in that data. There's just simply no way for the bad guys to get to it. Then the fourth, the 3-2-1-1 strategy, of course, when we get to the 2, tape can be the second type of medium for that. And of course, it fits into the 3 as well as one of the copies. Tape fits very well as a nearline capability or a nearline copy so that you have that online offsite copy. But you can also take that tape and, as I said, move it offsite so that it's offsite and offline, and thereby automatically air gapped and meeting that strategy. And then the fifth is being able to scan those tapes. So for me, Geoff, I think the bottom line here is that organizations who overlook tape as a technology for their backup strategy are really overlooking a huge arrow in the quiver of data protection.
Wow, that's really interesting, that last point that you made. And so tape can really be a good weapon against malware.
It really is. It is. It has all the elements that you need, and it certainly is part of the strategy. You know, there are other parts that are important as well, but tape is just a huge potential weapon in that arsenal.
That's a big deal, especially with the current trend of a lot more people working from home and malware being distributed in many different areas.
That's exactly right. The guys our research shows that actually 93% of organizations say they've been attacked by ransomware. I like to say the other 7% simply don't know it.
And that's the most scary thing about this. Since you bring up the issues of scalability, I remember one of your earlier comments regarding scale, when you said petabyte scale storage estates are no longer rare. Now, how can tape help? Surely it can't reduce the amount of data.
Well, yes and no. It certainly doesn't reduce the amount of data. You're absolutely right about that, Geoff. But it does play a very important role here. Research we've done shows that typically about 60% of data is rarely accessed, something that's sometimes referred to as dark data. In other words, data that probably hasn't been touched in the last 30 days and isn't likely to be touched soon. So if you think about, let's say, a petabyte of data, 600 terabytes of that is probably dark data. If you can move 600 terabytes onto nearline storage, you free up a tremendous amount of system resources, both compute resources, backup resources, disk resources, and so on, and put it onto a medium where it's still available and is still accessible within decent access times, often for analytics and other reasons. But to be able to move that tape to a very low, or be able to move that data to very low cost storage, can really change the economics in the IT organization as well, especially as many organizations are moving to all flash arrays. There's really no reason to put all that dark data onto a flash array. So being able to put it onto tape as a nearline media is really absolutely the most cost-effective way to do it. On a dollar per gigabyte basis, there is nothing that can touch it. You'll hear claims sometimes about disk being as inexpensive as tape. It really isn't, and I've never seen that. Even when you talk about the cloud, where you have a fraction of a penny per gigabyte per month, that adds up, especially when we're talking about hundreds of terabytes or petabytes. And tape can be a much more cost-effective way, either than on-premise disk or even cloud storage in many cases.
So two of IT's biggest challenges, ransomware and data volume, can be addressed by good old tape technology.
That's exactly right. And LTO tape has become the standard in the industry for tape. And it sets that standard and has a roadmap and has a consortium of vendors to assure compatibility about it. And so it really has become a huge weapon available to organizations to deal not just with ransomware, but also to help tame their data growth problems.
Well, Phil, this has been a really interesting discussion. Learned a lot about tape and good old tape technology that's been around for a while and has a lot of new uses for it. So we just want to thank you for your time.
You bet. It's been a pleasure, Geoff.